Please welcome to our virtual stage our keynote speaker, Dr. Sandra Upton, Vice President, Global Diversity Practice with the Cultural Intelligence Center.
Good morning.
Good morning, Sandra. Welcome to the summit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very excited to be here.
Wonderful. How are you?
It's early, but I'm doing fantastic.
Thank you. Now, Sandra, before we start having this conversation with you about cultural intelligence, Sandra is responsible for providing leadership and expertise on diversity, equity, and inclusion matters for CQC clients from across the globe. With over 25 years' experience, Sandra has led CQC's efforts to the growing demand from global companies such as Starbucks, Facebook, Google, and many more. She's also the subject matter expert for the Center's work in unconscious bias and has led certification programs across the globe. So everybody, please welcome Sandra to the summit today. Thanks, Sandra, for being here today.
My pleasure.
Sandra, I first discovered the space of cultural intelligence about a year ago. And discovered its importance for organizations, government agencies, institutions, that cultural intelligence actually went beyond a nice to have, and how it sat between the success and failure of organizations. So I've got a million questions that I would love to ask you, but we've only got 45 minutes. So Sandra, can you please share for those perhaps who may not know what cultural intelligence is? What is cultural intelligence? Why do we need it? Why does it matter?
Absolutely. Great question. And again, thank you so much for this wonderful invitation and to be a part of such an important dialogue today. So really appreciate the partnership with you and others. But simply put, cultural intelligence is the capability to function effectively in any multicultural situation. And there are 4 key capabilities that make up our cultural intelligence. So it is, again, a very research-based, evidence-based framework. So it's not just this idea that was pulled out of the sky, but extensive and robust research has been done behind this framework. And we know that it is proven to create success and successful outcomes. But there are 4 key capabilities that make up our overall cultural intelligence. The first capability is what we call CQ Drive. And that's all about your motivation and confidence and interest in engaging across culture. So if you're not even motivated or interested or confident, you're going to struggle. The next capability is what we call CQ knowledge. And that's simply your understanding about how cultures are similar and how they're different. So I can be motivated and confident and persistent, but if I lack understanding or knowledge around some of the cultural dynamics or nuances, again, I'm going to be limited in my effectiveness. And then the third capability is what we call CQ strategy. And that's all about taking that motivation and that knowledge to a place of strategy. How do I actually think about a plan for how I'm going to engage to ensure its effectiveness. And then the last capability is what we call CQ action, and that's all about behavior change. So our cultural intelligence is a form of intelligence. It's something that can be measured, and we know it predicts performance and engagement. So when we talk specifically about its relationship to racial equity or racial equality, there's a very strong connection there. And then one other comment I wanted to make is I know that in parts of the world like the UK, emotional intelligence is something that is often talked about. It's an incredibly important skill to have as well, but it's really important for people to understand that there's a huge difference between the two. I like to call them cousins. They are family. They both are forms of intelligence, but cultural intelligence picks up where EQ leaves off, right? So EQ is all about our self-awareness. It's about our understanding of how to engage with others, but it's culture bound. So it doesn't necessarily take cultural differences and dynamics and nuances into consideration. And so CQ simply picks up where EQ leaves off. I think that's really important for people to understand.
And there is obviously that direct link where we've got to connect the two together as well, and you bridge that gap between the two.
Absolutely.
And why does it matter so much?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. When we talk about very important and sensitive topics like racial equality, or I like to say racial equity, I think it's impossible to fully address these very significant issues and significant disparities and inequities that we are seeing across organizations and across industries without cultural intelligence. We really believe that it is the foundation and strategic link when we start talking about addressing these issues. So just like I highlighted that framework, you can easily apply it to racial equity as a real strategy, right? As a real evidence-based strategy for addressing inequities. So why is it important? It is really the non-negotiable strategy and skill that's critical to addressing racial equality and equity.
Thank you for that, Sandra. We've spoken about diversity and inclusion. We've had so many different conversations on equality, diversity, inclusion, equity. How is CQ the strategic link to diversity and inclusion? And can you perhaps share any examples of what this looks like in good practice, not best practice, but good practice? If there are any examples that you could share with us today.
Sure, absolutely. And I think before even demonstrating that connection, which I'm happy to do, I think it's important to step back to think about how are we defining racial equity, right? So it's this idea of actively, challenging and responding to individual and systemic biases, right? Behaviors and policies and practices, things that you talked about in your introduction, right? To ensure that every single person within an organization has fair and equitable opportunities, right? So if we think about that as the definition, and also part of that is recognizing that different culture groups, in particular racial groups, have different needs. So if we come into the conversation with this definition that is this proactive, right, this active commitment to ensure that everyone is being treated equitably and everybody is receiving equal opportunity, then we can come back around and use the CQ framework to help address that and move us towards real action. So if we go back to the framework, I think this is the most practical way to help people understand that relationship and that connection. If we go back to the framework, right, we talk about CQ drive. That's about our motivation and confidence and persistence. If we're not motivated, right, if we don't believe that inequities exist, we're going to have a hard time addressing them, right? So CQ Drive is all about acknowledging that those inequities exist. So if I'm the CEO of an organization, or if I'm in a leadership role in an organization, I have to start with the real belief that these issues are real, right? That racial equity or inequities are showing up inside my organization. And then I understand that. So now I'm motivated to address it. And I also have to have a level of confidence and courage to address it, right? That's all about our CQ drive, right? So we can develop the skills just for that basic commitment to say, this is real, we acknowledge it, and we are committed to doing something about it, right? Then if we go over to CQ knowledge, again, that's our understanding about how cultures are similar and how they're different. So now if I'm committed as an organization and as a leader to address this work, then I now need to develop some knowledge about what the issues are in my organization, right? That is all what CQ knowledge is about, right? So where are the disparities, right? When I look at leadership, is it an all white male dominated leadership? So that's a data point, right? So we need to do more to move people of color up the ladder. When we look at compensation, are we finding inequities in terms of how people of color are perhaps being compensated compared to other culture groups? When we look at our talent acquisition and recruitment process. So it's this idea of developing an understanding and looking at the key data points around if this is a real issue, what do the real challenges look like inside my organization? That's CQ knowledge, right? So then now I have this data and this understanding, and I'm motivated and I'm confident. Now we've got to put a strategy in place, right? And going right back to what you said at the beginning, what is our strategy? How are we going to put in behaviors, or bring in behaviors and adjust the systems and policies and practices that are encouraging these disparities, and how do we replace them with policies and practices and procedures that actually open up access across the board. And then that last capability is what we call CQ action. What individual behaviors need to change to make sure that we're minimizing bias in the recruitment process, in the promotion process, in the day-to-day interactions, right? So what learning and development and training do we need to put in place so that we adjust those behaviors? So you can easily and clearly see that that framework is an excellent guide, research-based guide that moves us towards real, tangible actions, right? And ultimately change behaviors and change systems that will ultimately close the gap and minimize those disparities.
So this is about making diversity and inclusion into the everyday within our businesses, looking at all of our policies, procedures, practices, and overlaying it with the CQC, the guide, in terms of the 4 steps that you have just mentioned, and the importance of using that data to help drive positive change and informed actions as well.
Absolutely, 100%. And helping people understand that all of this, when we think about the framework and how it applies to, again, create these good practices, the skill piece is so important, right? So it moves us beyond just having the conversations. It moves us beyond just this idea of being sensitive to and aware of these differences, which is, again, the drive, and that's an important piece, but it moves us to real action, sustainable action, and actions that can be measured.
And Sandra, you've worked with many organizations, from Starbucks to Google, who have all kind of bought into the whole CQ product. Is there an example of some good practice that you could share with us, something that Starbucks or Google have taken on board following the training on CQ? Is there something that you could perhaps share with us, what good looks like?
Absolutely. So, obviously the learning and development piece is critical to the process. So many of these organizations often start out by training and making sure that employees are moving along the continuum in terms of developing their own cultural intelligence. That's a big piece of it. So how do we improve our own CQ and use that collective understanding and collective skill set to change the organization? But then more specifically, and especially thinking about it from a systems perspective, which I think is so critical to this whole process and conversation. But let's go back to talent acquisition and diversity, right? So we have those who, as part of the recruitment process or onboarding process, ensuring that bias doesn't show up in the recruitment process. So practices may be, obviously, again, the learning and development, where people are trained to ensure that when they're making decisions around hiring, that they don't allow biases like affinity bias to show up. So you don't keep hiring the exact same people over and over again. They do things like making sure that the questions that are asked of candidates are consistent across the board. And they ensure that even in terms of their pool, that there is a demonstrated commitment to attract a diverse pool of candidates. So one of the things that I often will encourage, and I see this with some partners, is that when you're recruiting, for example, and you begin to use the argument, well, we can't find diverse candidates, or we can't find people of color, not allowing that as an excuse. That is not acceptable, right? What that means is that probably those traditional recruitment strategies that you've used in the past are no longer effective. And so you have to revisit, where are we recruiting from, and making sure that we're tapping into resources and connections and building relationships with diverse communities, so that we get that talent pool that, what I call, it's not leaky, right? But it is full with diverse candidates. And then building an accountability. So we find that partners, in some cases will say, don't even come to us. If we're looking to hire a person in X position, don't even come to me until you have a diverse pool. So you have no choice but to step back and, again, look at your processes and systems, but don't even come to the decision committee whoever is going to be making decisions around that hire, don't even bring us a pool if it's not diverse. Mm-hmm. And then the next step, a very practical step, is once you bring that diverse pool, when you make that final hiring decision, you have to defend why. So why did I choose to hire this person? And why did I choose to not hire that person? So that expectation and accountability, it forces reflection. It helps to minimize bias, and it influences individual behavior. So those are very real practical things. Even if we just think about the recruitment and talent acquisition process, can absolutely help to close the gap and disparities around, particularly around racial equity. So that's a real solid example that I've seen a number of partners use.
Thank you for sharing that, Sandra. And I think there's almost here an opportunity here. My question is, do we need to do a little bit more with perhaps the recruiting managers and the line managers to ensure that they are using inclusive recruitment processes, and that every single line manager, recruiting manager, perhaps goes through some kind of a checklist of, have you asked this question? Have you perhaps done this? Is there a framework which CQ perhaps provide for hiring managers and line managers to ensure that they have, avoided all kind of biases, make sure that they have gone out to, perhaps every single channel possible? Because I often, here in the UK, get asked the question, well, I just can't find the talent from this particular community. Good God, there is an abundance of talent here in the UK. You're not perhaps using the right processes or looking in the right places. And traditionally, recruiters tend to, as you mentioned, just go out to, their group of people.
That's exactly right. And again, I think that whole step in the process of forcing people to defend their decision, then if when you're coming to me, so let's say you report to me, but you have some hiring responsibility, but that when you make a decision, or you want to make a decision, but that you're going to be accountable to me to say, Sandra, I've got to explain to you why I chose this candidate, or why I'm interested in this candidate. And I've got to explain to you why it's going to challenge you to think a bit harder, right, before you come to me, right? And also, if I say to you, it's not acceptable to not have a diverse pool of candidates, it's going to force you to go back and figure out some other non-traditional ways to attract a diverse pool of candidates, in particular, people of color. So building those kinds of steps and expectations and accountability into the process are exactly the kinds of good practices that really move us in direction of doing a better job in closing those gaps.
Thank you, Sandra. Sandra is here with us for another 30 minutes. She's open to questions as well. So if anybody has got questions for Sandra, please pop them into the chat box, and we will try and answer as many questions as possible this morning. Moving on, Sandra, how can we embrace cultural intelligence to show up as allies for people of color and various communities that we work with? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I always like to go back to definitions, right? So that I'm ensuring that we are all on the same page in terms of what we think of as an ally, right? And the way I define ally, and I want to look at my definition so I get my words right, but it's any person that actively promotes and aspires to advance a culture of inclusion, right? And that commitment is through intentional and actionable efforts on their part, and they want to ensure that everybody is benefiting from this organization and all that it has to offer. And in particular, there's this focus on people of color that we're talking about today. So in order to be an ally, you need to understand that you have to be intentional, you have to be thoughtful, and you have to take action. So with that, again, using the CQ framework, being motivated and committed to it, it's now about how comfortable and confident are you going to be in terms of supporting others. And that can show up in so many different ways, whether it is calling out when you see, and a term that we use often in the US is microaggressions, right? But anytime someone takes an action or exhibits a behavior that is devaluing to someone else, as an ally, having the cultural intelligence, so not only the drive in terms of the motivation and confidence, but the actual skills, right? So to know when a microaggression shows up, to be able to recognize it, and then being able to make the commitment to speak up on behalf of that person. Right, that's one way an ally can do that, but they need cultural intelligence to do it. Another thing is just spending time developing their CQ knowledge. So you may not fully understand something because it's not been your lived experience, but CQ knowledge says, I'm going to be intentional about understanding more about your lived experience. What does that look like to you? What does that feel like to you? And then just having dialogue and building relationships with people of color to understand those lived experiences, and then having conversations around what is it that I can do to support you in terms of making sure that you're having an inclusive and positive experience in this organization. And then I think even going deeper in terms of making a commitment to be a mentor to someone, or even more significantly, sponsoring someone. And there's a big difference between the two. Both are important, but they're different. So it's this intentional idea of saying, I recognize that disparities exist. I recognize that different culture groups, particularly other races, have different lived experiences than I do, and I'm committed to helping to ensure that everybody has a positive experience in this organization. So I'm going to develop some CQ knowledge. I'm going to develop some understanding around some of those differences and pain points, and then I'm actually going to build a strategy to support a CQ strategy to support my peers of color by, again, being a mentor, speaking up when I see a microaggression, becoming a sponsor. If I have influence over policies and practices, ensuring that those policies and practices serve as a benefit to our employees and team members of color and not a barrier to them. So lots of different ways that allyship can show up, but it has to start with an intentional commitment to take real action. And it takes confidence and courage.
Absolutely. And I think it is about also having those uncomfortable conversations and making them comfortable. Sandra, you just mentioned, the difference between allyship and sponsorship.
Mm-hmm.
Could you perhaps articulate what, in your opinion, what the difference is between allyship and sponsorship? Perhaps for those that may want to know what the difference is between the two.
Yeah, and I actually talked about the difference between mentoring and sponsoring. So both mentoring and sponsoring can be forms of support by an ally, right? And so mentoring is typically where, you sort of take me under your wing and you just support me. You demonstrate that you want to see me be successful. And so you're there to answer questions. You're there to give me guidance and direction. You're there to, in some ways protect me and support me when we see racist behaviors or actions happen. And that's very helpful and that's very important. Sponsorship goes to a totally different level. And I think it's more powerful, especially within the context of racial equality, because it's about really positioning me. So sponsorship says, okay, Sandra, we both know that there are inequities in this organization. If we look at the top, we see that it is, again, pretty homogenous. It's all one particular culture group. And I want to help you get to the top. Right. So we're going to work together on a strategy, and I'm going to use my agency and I'm going to use my influence to help move you up the ladder in this organization. That's different than mentoring. We can have conversation and coffee and you can encourage me, and that's great. But sponsorship says we are going to take a deliberate attempt to literally move you up the chain, right? So that we can change how leadership looks. And we maximize your skills and talents at the highest level possible. And I'm going to use every bit of my agency and influence to get you there. So I'm going to sponsor you so that you can, and that's again where you can begin to see those gaps close when we talk about the inequities that we often see in organizations.
And how can people find their sponsors or mentors or their allies? How do we go about finding them?
Sure. Ideally, if you're within an organization, ideally you want someone that is in a position of influence, that does have agency, that does have power, right? And you can certainly, as the person of color, you can certainly seek that person out and say, I have these goals within the organization. We both know that we've got a lot of work to do in terms of becoming more diverse and inclusive at various levels across the organization. So I'm asking you to sponsor me and help me to get to where it is I desire to go. But I would say an ally is, rather than waiting on a person of color to come to them, to seek out, to look at those individuals in the organization who are from different races, and be intentional about going to them and saying, what are your goals and strategies? What is it that you want to accomplish in this organization? And then how I'm going to make a commitment to help you get to where you want. So ideally, I can come to you and say, can you help me? But ideally, it's really, if that ally is serious about supporting people of color, and they recognize the disparities, they will then take the initiative to go to their peers and colleagues of color and say, how can I help you and support you? And then they work together on a plan to move them up. So that's, you find each other, but ideally the ally takes the initiative.
Perfect. And I'd love to talk to you about leadership's walking the talk, but I've got a question from the virtual floor for you, Sandra. Are there any publications, any books where people can read up about CQ? We know we've got the great tools, the resources, the qualifications. Are there any books, for example?
Sure. There are several books.
The question is from Ian Workman.
What was the part two? I missed that part.
So I said that this question is from Ian Workman.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Great question, Ian. And the short answer is there are several books. I would encourage you as a starting point to go to the Cultural Intelligence Center website, which is www.culturalq.com. And if you click on the books and resources link, you're going to find a plethora of books there, in particular by the co-founder, Dr. David Livermore. He's written numerous books on cultural intelligence. And there are a few, for example, the cultural intelligence difference and leading with CQ. Those both have a very strong emphasis on the business world and the global business world. So very applicable to business in the UK and throughout Europe. So I would start there in terms of those books, but I would also encourage you, I have written over the last easily year and a half, if not longer, numerous blogs on cultural intelligence and its relationship to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, equality. And so there are several of those resources that are there as well that give lots of good practice and examples of how this actually can show up and should show up in organizations. And then also I facilitated numerous webinars that talk specifically about these issues, and they are talked about from those who are actually doing the work out in the work world. So I think those are all great starting points as resources for you to understand more about CQ and how it ties to this really important conversation around racial equality.
Perfect. So there's resource available on the CQ website. I'm assuming there's stuff available on other platforms as well to purchase some of your products. And Sandra, you're on social media as well, so people can follow you. You're on LinkedIn. Are you on Twitter as well? Could you just remind us?
Not as much. I probably should be more, but definitely LinkedIn. I often post quite a few blogs there and just a lot of insights around topics like racial equity and equality.
Perfect. Thank you. Right. If we go back to leaders, how do we get our leaders to, we hear lots of things. Leaders have great ambitions, great intentions. How do we get our leaders to walk the talk? What can we do to hold leaders accountable?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it is often the question of the day, right? I think, as a starting point, it goes back to that individual and personal commitment, right? So I think we should challenge them, one, to go on their own journey to develop their own cultural intelligence, right? So they can take the assessment tool, for example, to just see what their CQ is, and identify areas that they need to improve and make that commitment to go on that journey. I think that's incredibly important. And part of that journey includes really understanding what are the pain points in their own organization. Where are those disparities? Where are those inequities? And then what commitment have they made to even just build relationships with people of color, both within the organization and outside of the organization? So I think a huge piece of building that accountability is to challenge them to go on their own personal journey and growth around this space. And then I think beyond that, it's important to help them understand the benefits. People often resist these types of initiatives if they feel like they're going to be attacked or shamed, or made a bad example of. But if we can actually demonstrate to them, there's tremendous benefit to everybody. This is not a zero-sum game. We all win when we make the commitment to celebrate and leverage the diversity of our employees and of our team members. And so really helping them see how this is going to benefit the organization and how this is going to benefit their leadership. That is huge. And then demonstrating how, right? What is it that they need to do? I believe that every leader, when we talk about this work, needs to understand that it's not just the responsibility of the person that's over, equity and inclusion, right? But it's everybody's job. It's everybody's responsibility. So that means attaching some very specific KPIs and task to that leader. I mean, I think many of us have seen this huge trend, and maybe trend is not the best word, but we've seen this huge movement in the last year or so as organizations have put out these transparency reports. And part of it includes now that many leaders' compensation is being tied to their performance around equity and inclusion. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. So I think that can be a very powerful strategy, but I think it should be preceded by really, again, coming alongside leaders and really helping them understand that this is not a zero-sum game. It's not about attacking you, but let's start where we are, right? Let's meet everybody where they are, and let's all make this commitment to move forward. And then once we all understand that it is about all of us, not just some of us, then we can, it's this whole idea, if we know better, we do better. We have the facts and data. Now we're going to hold ourselves accountable. And that's when it becomes appropriate to say, okay, we're going to actually attach some performance objectives around racial equity and equality to your compensation. Right.
Let me just add to that. Yeah, absolutely. I must just add to this, Sandra, that CQ is a safe space. And this is about doing self-work. We can provide you with all the best tools and all the best resources, but we as individuals have got to put some work in as well, haven't we?
Absolutely. There's no way around that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Now, I've got so many questions coming in here, Sandra. So I'm going to try and get through another question. So I've got a question from Tim Petransky. Dr. Upton, the framework you have articulated is really interesting, simple yet powerful. What advice would you give to changing cultures to get people onto the first rung of the framework? I am constantly frustrated by the lack of understanding or desire to engage with the problems inherent within our society in the first instance. So how do they get onto that first rung? What do they do? Yeah. Where can they go?
Yeah, I think usually the first step is to, if we think about it from an organizational perspective, if we can get to leadership and to get their buy-in, to get them to understand what it is, what cultural intelligence is, why it's so important to the equity and inclusion and diversity conversation, and then get them to take leadership around this, to say we are going to be committed to moving this work forward. I think that's a helpful and important first step within the organization. And then I think beyond that, I think the learning and development piece is important. Just giving people opportunity and safe spaces to have conversations around why this is important. Why is it important for each of us to go on our own journey? And why is it important for us to address this within our own departments or units? And I think we can't stop there, right? We're huge on, we're hugely against this idea of sort of these one-off trainings. But I do think learning and development is a critical part of the process. And it's often a good starting point to begin to just create that awareness, that acknowledgement, and then to share and learn from one another, and then move us all towards some deeper action around the work. So I know it can be frustrating, and I know it can take time. And sometimes leadership commitment, it may not be, ideally, we obviously want it to be at the very, very top. Sometimes that can happen, but that doesn't mean you give up. Maybe then leadership is within your own department and you start there, right? Start those conversations. And then you begin to use some of the tools like the CQ assessment. I find that people really enjoy learning about their own CQ, and the fact that they can use this research-based tool to see where they are, and then actually strategies. Again, I think people resist the conversation sometimes when, one, they feel attacked or shamed. Two, they resist when they feel like they don't know what to do. Or they're afraid that if they say something that they're going to be, again, attacked or shut down. And so creating that safe space, and I qualify that by saying safe but courageous, right? So we have to get uncomfortable, but creating that safe space to say we're going to have this dialogue, we are going to move forward, but we're going to do it together, and we're going to give each of you resources and support so that you can grow. And we're not going to just throw you out there and say, here are these expectations, go at it, but we're not going to provide you with any type of support to help move you along. I think those are some of the basic strategies that really help minimize the resistance and move us in the right direction.
Thank you, Sandra. And thank you very much, Tim, for that great question. Sandra, thank you very much for that great answer. Just kind of staying on, you spoke about doing this together. Diversity and inclusion is everyone's business, right? Everybody is part of this journey, where we challenge our systems, policies, procedures, to looking at our data to do good work. How do we get everybody onto this journey together with us? And what is our destination? What are we aspiring for?
Yeah, that fantastic question. So if we begin with the end in mind, right, the destination is to create an organization that is culturally intelligent, right, and that is diverse, inclusive, and equitable. That's the end goal, right? So when we say an organization that is culturally intelligent, that means that the individuals in the organization have the skills that they need to navigate and work effectively across cultures. It means that we have systems and policies and practices in place that support diversity, equity, and inclusion and don't serve as barriers, right? So that's the end goal. Now, to back us up and to get us there, again, we've got to do some learning and development. We've got to develop the individual skills of folks across the organization. We have to look at those policies and practices across the organization. And then we have to build in accountability by tying metrics to the work, right? Giving everybody a job to do around this work. And then holding each other accountable to accomplishing that. So whether you are the CEO, right, where you clearly have a responsibility to communicate to the organization that this is who we are, it's going to be a part of our DNA, and we are going to move forward. Part of my responsibility is to commit the resources, financial and otherwise, to the work. To hold my leadership team accountable to this work and to hold myself accountable to this work. But then that's going to filter all the way down to folks who are on the front line that still have a responsibility. If you're engaging with customers who come from different backgrounds, it is expected that you engage with them in culturally intelligent ways. So I think it's assigning, ultimately, everybody has to be assigned some task related to this work. And alongside those tasks, some metrics that will allow us to evaluate whether or not you're making progress in that way.
Thank you very much for that answer. And if we could just go step back a little bit, we spoke about sponsorship earlier on. I've got a really great question here from, where we go, Adam Hussein. Might sponsorship be deemed as positive discrimination? And how would you navigate around this to affect real cultural change at the top of the organization?
Sure.
What do you
So short answer is no, I don't believe if it's done correctly, if we understand it and act out on it in the correct way, it does not and should not be discrimination, right? It's simply looking at, so part of that process goes back to CQ knowledge. So understanding what are the gaps and what are the disparities in the organization. And your job as a sponsor is to simply try and close those gaps. So again, if we go back to the leadership example, if you're with an organization where the entire leadership team is all white or all one particular culture group, and you know that you have peers and colleagues who desire to be in a leadership role, right? Sponsorship just simply says that we want to break that ceiling, and I have the agency, right, and influence to help you do that. So I'm not enforcing discrimination. I'm simply trying to close the gaps and create opportunity for everyone. So that is really the ultimate goal. And again, it's not about this zero-sum game where if this person wins, others lose, but we have to create room at the table for everybody. So I think that's really important. I forget part 2 of that question. Can you remind me what that was?
No, we were just talking about, sorry, let me just go back to Adam's full question. Bear with me a moment. Right, so bear with me. So the question from Adam is about sponsorship being deemed as positive discrimination. How would you navigate this to affect cultural change at the top of any organization? So it's how do you impact the leaders?
Yeah.
How do you get them to go on that journey together with you?
Yeah, and again, I think it goes back to holding them accountable, right? So I talked earlier about that good practice of now a lot of organizations are attaching compensation to KPIs around equity. That's a really powerful way to address it at that level. So you have a responsibility as a CEO, or if you're in the C-suite or any leadership role, whether it's manager, director, you now are going to be held accountable for ensuring that your teams are diverse and that your culture that you've created within your area is inclusive. And that you have made sure that there are no inequities across the different culture groups that you're responsible for leading. I think, again, that's really the bottom line in terms of impact. And I mentioned earlier, there's several things that we can do to move up to that place. There's the learning and development, their own personal journey. But ultimately, if we want to talk about real change, right, systemic change and sustainable change, it's those kinds of accountability measures that have to be put in place.
Thank you, Sandra. We're just coming up to the last few minutes of our session. It's been fascinating having you here today and learning so much about CQ. Now, for anyone who may have further questions on CQ, Ritika, Sandra's colleague, is in our virtual audience today. So please feel free to reach out to her in our chat box. We will also be sending out some details on Cultural Intelligence Centre and your products and services for anybody that wants to learn a bit more about CQC, who can take a free assessment on their CQ. That will be coming to them next Monday. So please do look out in your inbox for that. Finally, Sandra, I've got a question for you. Is there one action, perhaps a thought or a question that you would like to leave today asking or stating or questioning our delegates? What one thought would you like to leave with them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I would go back to challenging everyone who's listening in to do 2 things. One, do an assessment of your organization, or at least the sphere of influence that you have within your organization, and really do an honest assessment of where you see those gaps, those real gaps specific to racial equity and equality. And then the question, so once you kind of do that homework, right, just do an honest assessment, a full 360 of where are the pain points in terms of those gaps and disparities. And then the real question then becomes, how are you going to use your agency, right, to help close those gaps.
Mhm.
And it could be, you know, if you have massive influence, that's all the better. You know, if you have the opportunity to go in and change major policies and practices, by all means do that. Perhaps your level of influence is not that deep, but there are other areas that may not seem as significant, but can actually be very significant and transformational. But think about how you can use your agency to help close those racial disparities that are evident and real in every organization that we all are a part of.
Fantastic. Sandra, thank you so much for today. It's certainly has been a very fascinating 45 minutes, learning, you know, everything from the difference between allyship and sponsorship, mentoring and sponsorship, the capabilities that we could all have, you know, how we can make our policies and procedures, you know, make them more inclusive. So there is a lot that we have learned here today. Well, it's almost time to say thank you. We should certainly continue this conversation on as we develop our partnership together, because we're doing lots of work with Radhika and CQC. And I hear that there is a new book that is coming out soon by your founder. Is that correct?
That is correct. And don't quote me on the date.
Horizon.
That is on the horizon, and it absolutely will talk about issues related to race. So I think it'll be one that all of us will want on our bookshelves. I believe it's slated to come out in the fall of next year, so not too far off in the distant future. But I've had a sneak peek at it, so I promise you it'll be a purchase worth pursuing, and I think there'll be lots of good nuggets and tips in there that will help all of us.
Well, we will certainly keep our audience updated with the book launch next year. Sandra, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Catch up very, very soon, and have a great day. And thank you for all the learnings and everything that you have shared with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.